Excuse me. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on what part of the country you're in. I'm Sheila Gunn Reid, who is powering my way through a cold, and I'm joined by my friend William Diaz and Danny Bulford. Um, and we are hosting the Rebel News Daily live stream. This live stream used to be just hosted at noon Eastern, 10 Mountain, where we would talk about the news of the day. But as it turns out, the only news of the day is what's unfolding inside the Public Order Emergencies Commission in Ottawa, what we're calling the Truckers Commission. First off, before we get too far into what exactly we're doing here, how's it going, guys?
My site's going well. How are you doing?
It's good. I think so far it's reflecting pretty favorably on us.
Yeah, very interesting stuff today as well.
Yeah, I probably should have taken a sick day, but no amount of stretchy pants and heated blankets on the couch would take me away from watching Steve Bell get ripped apart by Brendan Miller. I should let everybody know how they at home can get involved in the stream. If you'd like to send us a chat, we'll do our best to read it on the air if time permits. If your paid chat is over $5, and you can do that on Rumble. It's called a Rumble rant. On Odyssey, it's called a hyper chat. And unlike the Trudeau colonized media doing their best to polish the turd of the Emergencies Act, we don't take a dime from Justin Trudeau, and that I think it shows definitely in our reporting. Now, I'll ask you, Danny, that we have you, what you're seeing at the Emergencies Act Commission with the chaos that's evident with the OPS. Was that your experience? You know, when you had what they call the PLT, the Police Liaison Team Unit, doing their best to negotiate to move some trucks and truckers being willing to do that. And then the OPS just moving in and undoing all of that, notably when they started seizing fuel and charging people with mischief for delivering fuel at Coventry, I think it was. What was your experience? Did you feel the chaos that we can all see now?
Definitely, yeah. And even for on our end of things, like people who were involved in volunteering with the protest, it was very chaotic because it was very last minute, massive in scale, and very little time to plan and prepare. And then I actually don't recall anyone being charged during the fuel seizure at Coventry. I know a couple of people were arrested, but I think they ended up released without charge, which is kind of what I would expect for people that were arrested for mischief, for obstructing enjoyment of property. That's not something I've ever heard of or ever did in my career, was to charge someone for that degree of mischief. Usually a mischief charge would only result after actual property damage had occurred. Now, but I think typically most of these big, large demonstrations or a big event that would happen in Ottawa where there would be multiple police agencies involved, like I used to be involved in, like a Canada Day, they're like, the planning begins for those a year in advance. And so even my own little sniper part of the plan, when I was still doing that job, we would start like months and months in advance. And so this all happened very, very hastily, right, as the convoy was converging on Ottawa. And I actually kind of had a chuckle to myself the other day when OPP Superintendent Abrams said that, you know, he was talking about short timelines and mentioned that he was engaged on January 24th. I kind of laughed because I wasn't engaged in the protest until January 26th. So he actually had more time to prepare than I did.
And you guys were still more organized than both the OPP and the OPS.
I honestly think, I don't know if you can give us the credit for being organized. I think it was just how industrious the working class of Canadians are. Like, anytime that there was a problem that we were trying to think of a solution to solve, people would just do it. They would just come up with a solution and just get the job done. Like snow removal, they just did it. Garbage collection, they just did it. People just took care of stuff. They just took care of business.
Yeah, well, that's a trucker mentality.
It is.
That's what the truckers do. But there's some things you said earlier. You talked about property damage, talked about actual damage that protester would do or rioters would do. For instance, we saw BLM protests. We saw buildings burn on fire, windows being being broken. I think from the beginning of the commission, we often talk about psychological so-called alleged damage on the citizens of Ottawa. We also often see that, and just today, Steve Bell talked about how the trucker convoy allegedly traumatized Ottawa citizens living in downtown core. And it seems like, according to his testimony, this is enough for him to want to arrest truckers, to want to make sure we implement the Emergencies Act, that we trample on the civil liberties of the truckers. What'd you make of that?
Well, I think, he's using that same inflammatory language that we've seen from elected officials, right? Where they keep talking about the violence that was committed against the protesters. And during Brendan Miller's cross-examination, he got Steve Bell to admit that no real violence within the threshold of the criminal code definition or the Section 2 of the CSIS Act, which is really the only type of violence that you might be able to articulate the implementation of the Emergencies Act to prevent or to address. So I thought that was key. Like, that was a great job from Brendan Miller. And it validates what my experience was, right? Like, we keep hearing all of these allegations of attacks on citizens and ripping masks off and all of these horrible behaviors from the convoy protesters. That certainly was not my experience. I didn't see it. And I was doing perimeter walks around the city of Ottawa late at night, early morning, all the time. And a lot of the people that were helping me in the volunteer side of things, same thing. We weren't seeing that. We weren't experiencing that. And every time I hear those allegations made, I think to myself, okay, well, where's the evidence of that? Because anyone can make a claim, but if you don't back it up with evidence, then it's just your word against ours, right? And in my experience as a police investigator, you almost always have to have some type of corroborating evidence to go with the allegation that's made. And so far, I've seen a complete lack of evidence to support those claims.
You know what? I think we skipped ahead of ourselves a little bit here, because we really have an expert in the house with us. For people who don't know, Danny, why don't you explain some of your background? Because for you to say these things about the police chaos, you come at this with some expertise.
Yeah, well, okay. So I was a RCMP officer for roughly 15 years. I spent the first 6.5, almost 7 years of my career doing general duty policing up in the Yukon Territory. And then I transferred to Ottawa in 2013, where for the last 8 years of my career, I was a full-time sniper observer on the National Division Emergency Response Team. And so, we would do all of the typical things that a tactical unit would be expected to do. Plus, because we were here in Ottawa, in the National Capital Region, one of our primary functions was supporting the protection of the Prime Minister and other VIPs, visiting heads of state. And so I've been involved in a number of these huge events that are often happen in downtown Ottawa. And actually, I've been heavily involved in the planning of those events as well.
I was going to say, you would be involved in the planning and preparation for an Emergencies Act level event. So I guess you would be the expert to say that this actually doesn't rise to any of those things. But you said a lot of really interesting things in your first response to us. One of the things I found interesting was the difference between a left-wing and a right-wing protest. A left-wing protest generally brings carnage, destruction, rapes, and drug overdoses. And in this right-wing protest, in 3 weeks, they built a little bit of a society. They had garbage pickup and street cleanups, and they were feeding the homeless, and they had, like emergency services almost, when people get hurt. But that's when you have useful people converging on a place, and they have useful life skills. But you also noted the lack of evidence for the things that former interim Chief Bell was saying. And I think that's why it's so important that he keeps redefining what violence means. He referred to violence as, the things that people were feeling emotion-wise, and not actually what they were experiencing physically. I tried to quickly write down what he was saying when he was pushed back by Brendan Miller. And he said he was describing the violence that they felt. and not the violence that they experienced.
Mm-hmm.
He said it was like the perpetual honking, the interactions they had on the street. So just the fact that there were blue collar people on their street who held different viewpoints, that amounted to violence. And you expect that sort of language from a left wing career student, but not the guy in charge of policing during the time of an alleged national crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on the honking issue in particular, yeah, for sure. The first couple of days, there was a lot of honking, but it's certainly like to say it was incessant 24/7, 7 days a week. That's not true. By 4 days in, I think by February 1st, I received my very first complaint from an Ottawa resident about the honking. And even by the time that I spoke to that Ottawa resident, I advised them that the truck captains had already established a honking schedule in respect of the Ottawa citizens, because they didn't want to wear out their welcome. And it was, I think it was roughly, if I remember correctly, it started off once on the hour from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then I think it got tweaked a little bit from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And then there'd be no honking throughout the middle of the night. Now, that's not to say that there may not have been the odd random honk throughout the 3 weeks outside of that scheduled time. However, the vast majority of the convoy participants and the truck drivers with the big horns prescribed to that because we were all on the same page. Everyone knew that the narrative was going to be completely stacked against us to try and demonize us and make us appear to be the worst type of human being possible. And so everything that the convoy protesters did was like a PR move by design, right? We wanted to make sure we appeared completely non-threatening. The message was always peaceful, no matter what. That's why there was the bouncy castles and the attempt to make it look like more of a festive atmosphere as opposed to like an aggressive one. The garbage collection, the snow removal, the veterans who stood on guard to provide security for the war memorial, the convoy protesters who tented out in those temperatures 24/7 to guard the Terry Fox statue. Every single allegation that was thrown at us, the protesters responded with their own solution to that problem, with the desired effect of winning over the hearts and minds of the people who are actually watching it firsthand.
And not only did you manage the honking only a couple of days after it started, but then you also had the injunction.
Yeah, the injunction came afterward.
That started with Zexi Lee saying that you're not allowed to honk anymore. So there was really no honking 24/7, 7 days a week.
That's completely false. Yeah.
Some of the things that Steve Bell used, he said there were hate or bias crimes, but and he also said assaultive behavior and a sense that residents couldn't leave their houses. Well, somebody else's agoraphobia is not really a civil liberties just like a justification to strip so many people of their civil liberties and seize their bank accounts, because a lot of people are on a little bit too much CBC and have too much anxiety. But the hate and bias crimes, that's actually a thing. And unfortunately, he has no evidence to back that up, because Brendan Miller just absolutely destroyed him when he impugned him with his own crime statistics. The first, and it was interesting because Brendan Miller was playing like 4D chess and I was just reading documents. So he went through the initial amount of actual charges that stuck between January 27th and February 13th. So the day before the invocation of the Emergencies Act, 16 criminal charges stemming from the convoy. At one point, I bet 100,000 people had converged on the city. And 16 charges. That was it. And as it turns out, the majority of those were for mischief, for delivering firewood and the like. But it was funny because Steve Bell said, "Oh, but you know what? There's a better document with a better breakdown." So Miller goes, "Yeah, I got it," and tries to show it to him. And then the OPS lawyer objects, which was pretty funny. But
can we show part of the sure.
I just want to go through the breakdown though. So as the breakdown was, the secondary document that OPS said was better, but then they didn't want to show it. There were no hate crimes, during the entire convoy. There were no charges of uttering threats to damage property. In total, there were 5 violent offenses charged between January 28th and February 13th. So 4 charges for assault. There were days when no one was charged whatsoever, and just 1 assault with a weapon charge. And as you know, that can be anything. It doesn't have to be a firearm. Go ahead.
I have some information on that, actually, which was
Please.
Spoken about at one of the press conferences that I did with Tom Quiggin during the convoy, where some of those offenses that are related to the protest were actually people who were targeting the protest. So one Ottawa resident who's well known to police, he's a police regular, he was charged with carrying weapons in a public place. So some of those weapons charges
Isn't that
stem
interesting?
from that. But there, and of course, the media wrote about it, but there was no correction made by the police or by the media after the fact. When and I had actually shared some of his social media posts with the police liaison, saying, "Hey, look out for this guy. He's talking about like harming people and harming the convoy." And then the assault with a weapon, I don't know for certain, but not too long into the convoy, there was a female counter protester, I guess you could call it, that was walking past people who were preparing food on the side of the street and used OC spray, like pepper spray, on some of the convoy protesters. And the Ottawa Police Service happened to be right there and ended up arresting her and taking her away. And then there was another report of a local Ottawa resident who had smashed the window, I believe at a Shoppers Drug Mart. And I believe it was actually called into the police by one of the truckers. So even though they claim that all these charges are related to the protest, it may be related, but it doesn't mean that offenses were committed by convoy protesters, right?
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
I think
that's
we're
just
seeing
like
a play on words.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it's just like the so-called arson that was attributed to the convoy and then it wasn't all of a sudden, but that lie got all the way around the world before the truth put its pants on. And I might be the only person who actually reads through the evidentiary documents that are submitted to the commission that they refer back to, and you can sort of see them scroll past interesting things. Well, I go back and look at those documents, and as it turns out, that arson was so deadly that it was never actually reported to police until the police saw the social media postings on the internet, because they reported it to Twitter and they didn't actually report it. And so the police went on their own to investigate, wondering why nobody had bothered to report this deadly arson. I guess because it didn't fit the narrative.
Can I also make one more point about the hate crime? Sure. You know, that was alluded to by Deputy Chief Bell. However, then his own crime statistics proved that there was no charges laid regarding any of those offenses. However, I am aware that there was a hate crime investigation by the Ottawa Police due to a hate crime that was committed against the Vanier Community Bikers Church during the time that the convoy was in town. Yeah.
And just before you continue, Sheila, because we've been talking for a little while, I think some of the viewers didn't necessarily watch the commission. So would it be possible to show one of the clips from Brendan Miller having the interaction with Steve Bell from this afternoon? Perfect.
Morris, already you sort of touched on that, and he had stated that the lack of violence in Ottawa during the protest was actually shocking.
So I don't recall that statement.
All right. So is it fair to say that when you use the phrase violence, you're not actually describing any form of physical assaults, are you? Well, physical assaults do contribute to what I'm describing. I was specifically describing the violence that our community felt as a result of the culmination of actions that the occupiers engaged in. So the violence that they felt, not actual violence, is that what you're saying?
That is correct. Not the criminal code definition of violence, but the violence that they felt by having incessant horns blared.
Right. And
by having trucks run 24/7 a day.
Right.
By having people intimidate them and follow them, and by having people rip masks off their head, by feeling sheltered in their homes.
Well, thank you. I understand what you mean. But you're not talking about violence under Section 2 of the CSIS Act, are you?
No, I'm not.
Thanks.
And he used the same arguments, the masks getting ripped off on the face for protesters.
Okay, that's actual violence.
Jim Watson did Yeah.
Yeah, but that's actual violence. Where's the charge for that? If that actually happened, where are those
No,
people to
exactly.
be charged?
And everything else, he just admitted that it has nothing to do with actual violence, according to your own laws. So, I mean, thank you for that, Steve Bell.
Well, I mean, and I think like the vast majority of us who were here would never condone anyone ripping someone else's mask off of their face or any kind of behavior like that. But I've heard that claim over and over again, and I have yet to see any compelling evidence that that actually occurred.
Or even an arrest related to the incident.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are some other crazy things that he said too. That he's, that he couldn't even, he keeps wanting to try to insist that the Emergencies Act was necessary. Seems to be the only one who's sort of playing that political side of it. The other one said, yeah, it would have resolved on its own. It was kind of nice to have. It sped things up, but it wasn't necessary. He's trying to play fast and loose, saying, it gave us that firm operational footing to create the exclusion zone, the red zone, as they called it. But from what I understand, they had the tools to do that under existing Ontario law.
Yeah. And so my experience with big events, like let's say the G20 summit that happened in Toronto back in 2010, which did involve like some serious property damage and burning of police cars during the riots, they had a controlled access zone established before that summit occurred. And they usually do before most summits do. And there was, and I don't know why you would require an Emergencies Act to establish a red zone when they establish controlled access zones on a regular basis without invoking an Emergencies Act.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I remember, I think it was the G20, they called it the free speech zone, but you could only like have your little free speech in like one area.
Yeah.
Laughable. I also noticed that Brenda Lucki, RCMP commissioner, featured prominently in a few things here. For example, there's an email between herself and public safety where she is telling them that she said, that said, I'm of the view that we have not exhausted all available tools that are readily available through the existing legislation. There are instances where charges can be laid under existing authorities for various criminal code offenses occurring right now in the context of the protest. The Ontario Provincial Emergencies Act, just enacted, will also help in providing additional deterrent tools to our existing toolbox. These existing tools are considered in our existing plans and will be used in due course as necessary. That's what she says on February 13th to the Public Safety Ministry. That's pretty damning, because that hangs it around the neck of the RCMP, but also Mendocino. His ministry knew that there was plenty of things they could be doing that they weren't doing. And instead, he just went, he hit the nuclear button.
Yeah, and even Deputy Chief Bell did finally, under cross-examination from Brendan Miller, did concede that there was existing legislation or existing tools that they could have used prior to requiring the Emergencies Act.
Yeah, there were other things too, like just if you read these emails back and forth, you guys were willing to move trucks. You were trying to move trucks. You're sort of limited. They don't have enough cops to help you move trucks because the OPP were dealing with Windsor. You can see that in the policing staffing up numbers. Once Windsor resolved, OPP deployed to Ottawa. It had nothing to do with the Emergencies Act. But there were times in here where you could see that you guys were trying to move trucks, but then they said, don't move them there because the senators will have to walk past them. So, it was just like, like you guys were doing your best, it sounds like, to alleviate the pressure, the violence, if you ask Steve Bell, on the local residents, but the police weren't being accommodated, and they were sort of trying to spare the well-kept senators the ugliness of it all.
Well, and one other thing that Deputy Chief Bell said in his testimony that kind of piqued my ears, but it's consistent with what we've heard from other police witnesses so far, is he kept saying that the Emergencies Act provided this stable framework for what they're to basically execute their plan. But prior to that, earlier in his testimony, he was using that same language, and he said something about to clarify or clearly communicate to our members what authority they were acting under. And so I think there's been a lot of discussion back and forth between the police witnesses prior to Steve Bell about how there was a lot of questioning amongst police, especially for the fuel seizure at Coventry Road, as to what lawful authority they were about to conduct an enforcement action under. And there was definitely some contention and some debate within the police services about their lawful authority to do what they did. Mm-hmm. And to me, my impression, which seems to have been confirmed by, I think, I can't remember if it was Chief Superintendent Retired Party or Superintendent Abrams from the OPP. I can't remember which one of them said that it was more like the political masters, or maybe that was Chief Slowly's notes. Mm-hmm. One of them, but they were more, it seemed like it was probably more of an action that was influenced by, I would say, Ottawa City Hall. I would presume Ottawa City Hall to like show like the residents, the angry residents, like a quick win of sorts.
You know what? That came out in the testimony of the hyper anxious city councilors, Matthew Fleury and Catherine McKinney. They said that they wanted to pass bylaws, even though bylaws couldn't, the bylaw officers were told by the police, don't enforce in the red zone. Or if it's convoy related, you don't enforce, we'll come in and do it. So they said they wanted to bring in additional bylaws. They said, give us your top 3 bylaws for us to pass to make it look like we're doing something. Because they were willing to bring in bylaws nobody could enforce just for the perception of usefulness.
For political optics.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think it was Abrams who said that it was I forget what I was going to say. He was talking about I think the paranoia of Chief Slowly. He seemed really paranoid that people in the ministry wrote to get him. He thought the OPP were acting against him. It just revealed not only the chaos, and the chaos came from the top down all along. I thought maybe Slowly is maybe one of the not truly bad guys. Not to say that he was good, but maybe not that he was great. But no, I don't think there are any good guys in here. I keep describing it as that Spider-Man meme where they're all just like dressed the same and pointing at each other. No, you're the bad guy. You know, no, they're literally all the bad guy here. You could see the reiteration of the political narrative when Brenda Lucky, sorry, I'm reading from my phone. She said in a communication with OPS that they need to consider other treading narratives. For example, if this was BLM, would policing be so hands-off? Is this woman crazy? You couldn't get more hands-off than the people dealing with BLM. She said, we think of the protest, politicians think of the impacts on people. And she said that we need to take a more measured approach. But you could tell that she was thinking about the political optics of this, and it sounds like she wanted more enforcement, but not necessarily the Emergencies Act.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. That was my interpretation of what she was writing, or what she had communicated as well.
Sorry, I'm just going through my notes here. Do we have another clip? Sorry, go ahead.
I just saw on that post that you just had up on the screen there about the cops taking a knee. Yes. I was doing Overwatch for the ground people during the BLM protest here in Ottawa, and they were intimidated into taking a knee. They were having people, like huge crowds of people, right? It was a massive crowd of people, were like just yelling at these handful of poorly equipped officers on the ground in front of the American embassy and throwing items at them, specifically like bottles of like water bottles, until I think all but one of them, if I remember correctly, all but one of them took a knee. And basically they were demanded to take a knee in submission. Yeah. And you didn't see that from the convoy protests. That's for sure. I never.
Now I remember what I was going to say. It was the concerns from Abrams about his officers being involved in illegal arrests.
Right.
He called them snatch and grabs.
Yeah.
Which is like narco state stuff. And he said that his OPP officers, this is what Slowly wanted to do. And he said, forget it. No OPP officer is going to be involved in that. And he wanted to grab the high profile protest organizers and influencers. So I guess based on your social media account, maybe, wanted to grab them. And there's some evidence that Brendan Miller alluded to from some people involved in the protest that they were snatched and grabbed, and he described it as kidnapping because they were not charged. They were pulled out of the protest and driven to the outskirts of town and dropped off in a parking lot at -30 without a building or a phone. Nobody knew where they were. They didn't know where they were dumped there. And that's how people end up dead, if I recall correctly, from an incident in Saskatchewan about 10 years ago.
Yeah, the Saskatoon Police Service.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that Abrams was really concerned that his guys were not going to be involved in. But that was what Slowly and Chief Bell were doing.
Now, I do think most of those arrests happened during the major mobilization where they were dismantling the convoy on the 18th and the 19th.
Yeah.
But I have spoken directly to people that happened to. They were driven out to an industrial area and dropped off and just had to make their own way back to some degree of shelter or reconnect with people all on their own.
And that's you would know better than me. I guess it was the Saskatoon RCMP, or was it the municipal police that they used to do that, and somebody ended up dead.
Yeah, it was I'm pretty sure it was Saskatoon Police Service, and yeah, that was something that was discussed in my former career, especially working up north where winters could get quite bitter. Like there was often times where people would deliberately try to get arrested so that they would have a warm place to sleep for the night.
Yeah. No, sure. It's very, very, very interesting to hear. You know what, Sheila, I can see Keith Wilson, Tamara Leach's lawyer, that entered the studio with us. So I guess we'll throw to a quick ad and we'll be able to switch the guest and have him on.
Yes. Let's thank Danny before he goes, though. Thanks, Danny, for your expertise.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Always a
unique
pleasure.
Perspective. Thank you. We'll have you back soon.
Thank you.
Hey folks, from October 13th to November 25th, we are here in Ottawa for the Emergencies Act inquiry organized by the Public Order Emergency Commission. But why the Emergencies Act inquiry? Well, because during the Freedom Convoy back in February, Justin Trudeau used a never invoked before Emergencies Act to basically seize protesters' bank accounts, seize protesters' money, seize their assets, trample their civil liberties. So we're here this month for the next month and a half to figure out if the way the government acted was lawful and was appropriate. So we are here to hold the government accountable, but we need your help. We are here to cover it for you because everyone else here is mainstream media. So if you want to help us cover it, if you want to help us bring you the other side of the story, factual, actual news, go to truckercommission.com and consider making a donation.
Thursday in Ottawa, the Public Order Emergencies Commission kicked off. It's an inquiry into the actions of the government, or at least it's supposed to be. The inquiry is allegedly meant to examine whether or not the government was justified in invoking an anti-terrorism law called the Emergencies Act to euthanize peaceful anti-COVID mandate protests taking place in the nation's capital, but also in other locations across the country.
My choice! My body! My choice!
Now, the convoy to Ottawa spent nearly 4 weeks completely peacefully demonstrating against lockdowns and vaccine passports. It evolved into a nearly month-long street party replete with bouncy castles, hot tubs, street hockey, concerts, and community outreach efforts like soup kitchens and food for the homeless. Rebel News, as we were for the convoy to Ottawa, will be there on the ground in Ottawa to cover the commission from the beginning to the end, because you just cannot trust the mainstream media. And in fact, that's what today's report is about. We've rented an Airbnb in Ottawa where we're sending a rotating cast of journalists to report on the Public order emergency inquiry. Now, you can help support our efforts there at truckercommission.com. The mainstream media's reporting about the alleged foreign nature of the convoy funding was cited as a reason the Liberals invoked the Emergencies Act to arrest, detain, and seize the property, bank accounts, and assets of anti-Trudeau demonstrators.
Oh, hey, Sheila.
Oh,
back
hi.
again.
Sorry, I'm back again. Hi, Keith. Thanks for joining us. First of all, I'm very sorry that you're going to have to listen to me croak my way through this. But I wanted to ask you, we heard some crazy things today that Brendan Miller alluded to that we'll hear more of. And one of the things was the snatch and grabs that Superintendent of the OPP Abrams mentioned earlier, where protesters were taken by police, OPS, it sounds like, to the outskirts of town when it's bitterly cold, basically kidnapped, as Brendan Miller said, and then just dumped out there with no phone, no shelter, and no way to get back or no way to get help, no way to let anybody know where they are. What do you know about this?
Well, it's deeply disturbing. I spent part of the day actually reviewing the witness statements from a number of these people. One of the people who we've asked to have the right to testify is a mom in her 30s, and she had gone to Ottawa to protest. She has an interesting story as to why she went there. She's got young kids, and someone was handing out copies of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And she approached the police line with the big goons in their green with no badges, no identifiers, nothing. And she put the Charter of Rights down on the ground in front of her, and she got on her knees and into a submissive position. And she said to the police, she said, if you advance further, you will literally be trampling on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They snatched her up, dragged her violently, and sucked her into the line. They close the line right up when they pull you in, kneed her, put her, as she put her face in the snow, put her arms behind her back and zip tied her, put a rifle in her face.
Oh my God.
Then they marched her over and put her in a police line outside, no gloves on, hands tied behind your back, -25, not including the wind chill. And it is a damp cold for those of us from Alberta, because I experienced it, and it's penetrating. And then waited to get processed, had to wait in another line, taken over, put in a paddy wagon line, put in the back of a paddy wagon unheated for many hours. No bathroom break, by the way, folks. And then even though she was released, in air quotes, and not being arrested, she was still detained. That's where the kidnapping comes in. And then driven to the outskirts of town with no services, no building, no phone, and kicked out. Of course, her cell phone, like everybody else's, was dead because of the long period of time and it being so cold.
And it's cold.
So this happened to likely hundreds, we know dozens and dozens of people. This is our new Canada under Trudeau.
Yeah, this is insane. That, like I said to Danny Bulford, that's narco state stuff.
Yeah.
Abducting regime protesters against the government, just disappearing them for hours and then dumping them somewhere. And as I said to Danny, you think the police would have learned their lesson after somebody turned up dead in Saskatoon when they did this in the cold. And now they're doing it to moms. Another thing they were doing to moms that really stuck with me was the intimidation of the parents during this protest. Navigator, just the greasiest political firm there ever was, they midst deep in this stuff, they watched the left-wing Twitter mob say, oh my God, those truckers have their kids with them. So Navigator advises the OPS, advises the OPS that our next communication strategy should be intimidating the parents by threat or possible seizure of their children from the convoy, because apparently blue-collar people who don't like Trudeau cannot be good parents. And to their credit, Child Services had no part in this. Apparently they were blindsided in that press conference and not exactly happy that they were used as a tool to intimidate otherwise good parents at the hands of the OPS. What do you know about that?
Well, I know that because I was in the operations centers when that message was coming in, and the extent to which they were being manipulative is remarkable. It's disturbing. Another example of third world tactics, right? Knowingly creating false fear on parents and children and kids to advance your objective of trying to protect the prime minister from his embarrassment for his gross overreach and politics of division. So it was highly effective. It created a lot of fear and uncertainty, both within the leadership and on the ground. Of course, these parents had their children with them because they were seeking to fight for the rights of their children, for their charter rights, to give them a future. Again, what's remarkable is each day that unfolds, and remember, we're only on day 8 of 38 days of evidence, something spectacular comes out to expose how deeply concerned all Canadians should be about the conduct of this government and how far they're willing to go to oppress and intimidate and beat up and kidnap those that seek to challenge the government. We're going to stay on these guys. We got to keep the truth coming out. It's outrageous.
It's one of the most disgraceful things I've ever heard, using children against their parents that way, or at least fear of having their children taken away. You think about what it takes to end up in Ottawa. These are people, I mean, frankly, these are my people. They're from the oil patch. They're truckers, they're farmers. They just want to work. They want to provide for your family. When you get those people mad enough to drive across the country to protest for weeks, a normal government would have a sober second thought, but not this one. These are people who've had their livelihoods taken away from them. They've got nothing left to lose. They've had their right to travel, their right to visit their sick and they're dying, the right to go to funerals, stripped away from them, the right to work, the right to provide for their family. All they have left is their children and maybe the truck. And the government was willing to take both. Why? Because they held the wrong political views. Today was just a day that put me a little bit off the rev limiter, and I don't know if it's because I'm sick, but I just didn't have the patience to listen to testimony about my fellow Canadian citizens being abducted by their own government and parents being intimidated because they didn't leave their children behind for weeks in their homes.
Yeah,
There was one more. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just to say that you're absolutely right, Sheila. Like, all of these things happen. We saw people getting thrown out of the police cars kilometers away from Ottawa because that was the way they were arrested. We saw, as you were just mentioning, the story of this 30-year-old mother that was brought into the police line. But the witnesses decided to focus on microaggressions, on alleged threats of violence, and alleged psychological phantom honking. They decide to focus on these little things instead of focusing on the actual violence that took place from the police, from the government during the Freedom Convoy.
Uber Eats.
Yeah, right. Uber Eats wasn't able to operate properly in town. No.
But Sheila, what do parents love second to their children? Their pets. And guess what else they announced? They announced that the conditions were unsafe and inhumane for any pets that were in the trucks. Many truckers have small dogs and medium-sized dogs. They're their companions. And so they were threatening that they were going to take away, the Humane Society was going to come in, they said. And again, it was Navigator that came up with this, that they were going to, if you didn't have children, but you had a pet, they were going to take your pet away. There was this psychological operation that they were launching, rather than just trying to deal with the issue.
You want to talk about psychological terror. I listen to people complain about idling trucks. It's psychologically terrorizing to parents to threaten to strip away their children, or a trucker whose only companion on the road is this dog because he held the wrong political views, because he tried for a moment, for once in his life, to speak truth to power. I am dying to know, and I'm going to file as soon as I'm done this. I want to know how much Navigator was paid for this sleazy, greasy operation. Who paid them? Was it the city of Ottawa? Was it OPS? Regardless, it's the Ottawa taxpayer. But I want to know how much they were paid to craft this campaign of terror against innocent people.
No, totally. Can we show the viewers, because earlier we showed part of the cross-examination that was done by Brendan Miller with Steve Bell. Can we show part of the testimony given by Steve Bell from the beginning of the day?
Good afternoon, Interim Chief Bell. I'm Rob Kittredge, acting for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms at these hearings. And I have just a few questions for you today. And to show my hand a little bit, they're all geared at, as you say, fleshing out and discussing the necessity of invoking the Emergencies Act. I'd like to show with these questions that under your leadership, the OPS was quite capable of clearing the process, even if the Federal Emergencies Act was never invoked. So, as I understand your testimony today, you identified 4 ways in which the invocation of the Emergencies Act may have been helpful to police in clearing the protests. First, it streamlined the swearing in of officers from other jurisdictions. Second, it made it easier to procure towing services. And third, the power to freeze financial accounts may have led some protesters to leave Ottawa voluntarily. Is that a fair characterization of your first 3 points?
Yes, but I don't believe I said may have been helpful. I believe I indicated it was helpful.
Which one? The power to freeze?
All of them. Okay. All of them were helpful.
I'll admit a little editorial work on my part there. So things were a little bit rushed at the end of your time with Commission Counsel earlier, and I want to make sure that I properly understand your 4th and final point, which was basically you said something like, the invocation of the Act created a solid legal framework within which police could do their work. Am I understanding you correctly to think that the framework that you're referring to there meant the power to create an exclusion zone?
That is correct.
Okay. So going to your first point, streamlining the swearing in of officers from other jurisdictions, Acting Deputy Chief Ferguson testified that saved a few hours and some paperwork. Would you agree with that testimony?
No, and not to contradict Deputy Chief Ferguson, but as my role of CAO, one of my responsibilities was the processing of those swearing-ins. It is a much more labor-intensive administrative process that has several checks and balances and layers to it. So I personally wouldn't describe it in hours. I would describe it in normally days. It likely could be streamlined into 24 hours, but there are a lot of people you have to line up to be able to do that.
All right. So in short, though, it could likely have been done in 24 hours.
Well, it could likely have been done in 24 hours, but I don't think the benefit was as to when it could get done. I think the benefit was that as soon as a member was boots on the ground in Ottawa, landed in Ottawa, they were operationally ready to be deployed. And that's what we needed as we were bringing members in from across the country.
But you don't dispute that those officers could have been sworn in without emergency powers, do you?
Oh, no, they absolutely could have been sworn in without it. It just could have created a backlog in lag time,
right,
particularly with the number of officers we were bringing to the city from all across the country.
All right. So in this regard, though, the invocation of the Emergencies Act was helpful to police, but not necessary, strictly speaking. Is that fair to say?
It was helpful to us, yes.
All right. Thank you.
Helpful, but not necessary. Isn't it interesting? 24 hours is what he needed. Ferguson the other day said it probably saved us a few hours, but boy, if I recall correctly, the Toronto Mounted Unit was there pretty darn fast to run over a bunch of old ladies in mobility scooters pretty quickly. Not a lot of lag time there, and we heard from the OPP that actually swearing them in is completely unnecessary because they can enforce criminal code infractions and Highway Traffic Act stuff. So, vehicle infractions, they had the right to do that. And they could have engaged in any sort of arrest for mischief without invoking the Emergencies Act to speed up the process. There was no process involved for them coming. And once the Windsor blockade resolved, they all deployed to Ottawa. You can see it in the numbers of the police being deployed, that it just went up by hundreds once the Windsor blockade resolved.
Yeah, and I mean, we have a lawyer right here, but I don't think the act has the right to be invoked only because it's helpful. I think it has to be necessary, no?
Convenient.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've read the Emergencies Act many times, and I can tell you with great certainty, administrative convenience is not a trigger. And again, we must remember, and I'm going to keep saying this because it's so important, what's the big hullabaloo about the Emergencies Act? Well, it allows the government to write a blank check over your rights and your bank account and your insurance policies and your RRSPs. It is the most extreme legal power that exists on the books in Canada. That is why it was only previously ever used when it was called the War Measures Act during World War I, World War II, the FLQ crisis, and now an embarrassed, petulant child prime minister who the working class said enough. We're tired of you taking away the futures from our children and our neighbors and our communities. We're tired of you ignoring the charter and the rule of law. We're tired of you in your arbitrary divisive politics trying to get reelected again in your election by pitting one group of Canadians against another. And we're coming to Ottawa to take a stand. This was not a proper basis, just at a pure sort of common sense level, let alone clearly illegal level. They haven't, each day that goes by, at the end of the day, myself and the others on our legal team, we look to one another and we go, well, anything yet? Nope. There's been no evidence from any witness that supports the legal criteria for the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
And I think it's really important that the bar is never lowered. That's a really important point to make here, I think, is that this is for a 9/11 event on Canadian soil. This is like if the Russians invade us, that's when we use this. This isn't for bouncy castles, hot tubs, and embarrassing a prime minister with no shame, which, you know, I'm surprised it's possible to embarrass a guy who performs like he does, but here we are. So it's really important that we never lower the bar to just people who inconvenience a couple of thousand Ottawa busybodies, because really that's what this comes down to.
Yeah, or that hurt the feelings of the prime minister. I'm sure he would like this to be a crime, hurting his feelings. Yeah. Poor Justin.
Well, and you know, when the FLQ crisis, the kidnappers were the actual terrorists and not the police. So we've got the inverse going on this time around. I also noticed that today, and I was talking with Danny Bulford about this, is that there were Brenda Lucky features prominently in today's testimony, that she was concerned that they should not take a hands-off approach. She said something so crazy. She said, if this were BLM, what would we be doing? Well, I said, taking a knee.
A lot less.
A lot less. You wouldn't be arresting them. But even she weighed in. She weighed in an email with public safety on February 13th. And she said there are plenty of more resources to use, including existing Ontario law, than the Emergencies Act. And I think that is a very damning thing, because that was directly with the minister's office, Mendicino's office, directly from the RCMP, saying there are still tools in the toolbox to use. We don't need to go nuclear. And then the next day they went nuclear.
Well, and it was the prime minister and the cabinet that went nuclear on the Sunday night after they were briefed by their senior security advisor from the Privy Council, which was documents of that were released in early August, that the borders were reopened, and that there'd been this breakthrough agreement that I was involved with in Ottawa to move the trucks out of the downtown and concentrate on Wellington and have the rest go out to our base camps. And so there was just no factual basis on the ground. We were de-escalating, and he stopped it because as I said, when I got the phone call, it was interesting when Brendan Miller, because I briefed Brendan on my phone call that I received from Steve Kay, the city manager, on the Wednesday. I provided my Rogers cell phone record so you could see he texted me and he said, Keith, are you available for a call? A few minutes later, you see that he calls me. We speak for 11 minutes. That's a long time. What did we talk about? First of all, he was he's a very upbeat guy, and his tone was right down bottom. And I was like, uh-oh, what's up? And he's like, I got bad news. We've tried hard. I thought we were going to pull this off, but it looks like it's not going to happen. The new interim chiefs intervened and the federal government's intervened, and they're not going to let us do the truck moves. And I remember saying to him, looks to me like the prime minister wants his Tiananmen Square moment.
Yep.
And that's exactly what happened. He wanted to retaliate against law-abiding Canadians of every ethnic background, particularly of the working class, the blue-collar, non-laptop civil servant class, for daring to reject his offer of let them eat cake. And so he sent in the goons, and we just got to keep getting the truth out here. It's completely wrong what's happened. And I have been struck by some of the honesty of like that we've talked about this, the head of the OPP's intelligence unit. I mean, it was just remarkable, his truthfulness. And even Steve Kay was very candid and honest in his testimony, as was the mayor's chief of staff. I didn't think that was going to happen. I was worried that they were all going to tell a story, and we were going to have to work a lot harder in Cross to try and get the truth out and work harder with our witnesses. But so far, this is not going well for the government at all.
Yeah, and when you talk about honesty, there's just two last things I want to make sure we touch on before we close the live stream. I saw recently GCCF announced that you are calling for the commission to call the head of the CBC, state-funded CBC, as a witness for the Emergencies Act inquiry. Can you explain why the GCCF is pushing for that to happen? So
a number of the legal teams have joined together, and we've made a formal request under the rules of the inquiry process for the commissioner to use his subpoena powers to compel the attendance of the head of the CBC. Now, of course, she's going to have to come in from out of country, because apparently she spends a lot of time in New York.
She lives in New York,
we'll have to wait for her to land at Pearson to serve it. But and it's the same mechanism that was used by the commission today to subpoena Premier Ford, because he was refusing to voluntarily attend. But why would we want the head of the CBC to testify? If you look at the order in council constituting this inquiry and giving the commissioner's mandate, one of the things that he's to delve into is misinformation and disinformation. Well, who comes immediately to mind when you start to think about misinformation and disinformation in the media? Like, I mean, the CBC is almost in a class on their own. So, it's remarkable to me that the federal government seems to think that anybody who talks about the vaccine being experimental is engaging in misinformation, when I, under oath, got Dr. Larenko, who's the head of Health Canada that approved the vaccine, to admit that it's experimental. So how can her testimony under oath be misinformation? Our view is that we're going to seek to expose the misinformation of the government. They're trying to characterize everything that the convoy was talking about, and the motivation for Canadians to, on cold winter weather, to come out to Ottawa was driven by misinformation. No, it was driven by an understanding of the truth and their disdain at the misinformation from the state-funded media. The federal government. That's why we've sought to subpoena the head of the CBC. So this show ain't over yet, man.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if Shaxley comes to the commission. Yeah, I really hope so. And you touched on Doug Ford. I remember one of our first, I think our first interview that we ever did at the commission, I asked you about Doug Ford and what were your thoughts on him not testifying. You told me that you believe he can send his message across through his counsel, through the Attorney of Ontario. But you seem right now to want Premier Doug Ford to be testifying in front of the committee. Did you change your mind, or can you explain why you think it's important for Doug Ford to testify? Because the COVID-19 mandates were federal. The Emergencies Act was handled by the federal government, but I'm sure Doug Ford had a role in that as well.
Sure. Well, just to clarify, I know there's so many different groups with so many names at play. It was the CCLA, so a civil liberties group, and another group, as well as the Ottawa Residents Associations Council, that have made the formal request for Doug Ford to be called to testify. In the face of that request, the commission disclosed that they had been making numerous requests for Mr. Premier Ford to testify, and he'd been refusing them. And so as a result, the commission on its own initiative had gone ahead and subpoenaed him. It only came to light when a formal request was made by these other groups. I don't see him, in my view, in our legal team, we don't see him as a significant player. Others do. I think it's helpful to have him come. But my understanding as well, and I haven't been able to confirm this independently, but somebody said to me that apparently he's seeking to challenge the subpoena. Wow. Good luck with that.
He really doesn't want to appear in front.
Yeah, well, why do that? I mean, that was, the Prime Minister could have done that too, and instead he got out in front of it and said, oh, I'd be happy to testify. I welcome the opportunity. That's the smart political move. So why Ford is now going to draw more attention to himself by seeking to fight the subpoena, if my very recent information is accurate, is strange. I guess the cautionary tale for government and politicians is, and the wisdom of those who enacted the current version of the Emergencies Act to require this inquiry. Some people have said, well, if there's no penalty at the end, if there's no consequence, what's the value in it? I think we're seeing the value of it. We're seeing the truth come out slowly in a methodical way, in a pace that's digestible. But each day is literally shocking in terms of the level of incompetence and corruption that's being exposed by these governments.
Yeah, and Doug Ford initially said, I don't know if you remember, Doug Ford initially said that he wasn't asked to testify for the Emergencies Act at the beginning, yet we saw today that he was asked on September 19th to testify. Can we show the clip where Ford says that he was never asked to testify for the Emergencies Act inquiry?
Do we have that clip? Honestly, I don't know what Doug Ford's going to tell me that Trudeau won't. Like, those two are in lockstep. So I don't know what new thing he might tell me, but if we do have that clip, that would be great. If not, we should throw to an ad so that Keith can gracefully leave the set without getting tangled up in his headphones.
Yeah, we're already past 7 p.m. anyway.
Yeah, we'll get to the chats, and then we'll, if we could throw to an ad so that Keith can leave, so we don't have to look at his midsection as he gets up and walks off set. And then we'll finish our chats, if that's okay, Olivia.
My mug? I know. It's pretty cool. So is this hoodie I got on, and you could have it on too if you check out our special website at rebelnewsstore.com. That's where you can see Freedom Focus hoodies that we have for you, beanies, cell phone cases, you name it, all while supporting our journalism, where we fight to bring you the other side of the story, as opposed to, being forced by the Trudeau government to fund leftist media out of your taxes. The truth is, without you and your generosity, there is no Rebel News. So again, if you like the reports that we bring you and that we also fight for freedoms in Canada, please consider doing some shopping, picking up some swag at rebelnewsstore.com. We appreciate your support.
Welcome back. I wish I had said some nicer things to Keith before he left. Forgot to thank him for.
We'll definitely see him again this week, Sheila, for sure. And look what we've got right here in the studio. Are we able to see? No, it's our
Yankee.
It's probably the loudest member of the Rebel News family.
Hi. Your voice
Hi,
is
Yankee. Completely, yeah.
Completely. Well,
but no. So Doug Ford,
today.
I think we found that clip, so we should throw to that Doug Ford clip.
Yes.
How come, Premier Ford, you're not testifying at this inquiry? Were you asked? Did you decline?
I have not been asked. Again, I want to repeat what I said earlier. We have top officials from the OPP that were running the operation with conjunction with municipal police agencies and the RCMP. You know, our police did an incredible job. They were very peaceful. They moved forward. And I am so proud to stand here and back our police right across this country and right across this province. I'll always support our police. They're professional, they're polite, and they ended up getting the job done. Thank you.
Little liar.
Like I
who
said, there's nothing he's going to tell me that Trudeau won't.
Yeah,
You know,
yes,
we're inside the same brain.
Yeah, progressive doesn't go with conservative. They're antonyms.
It's an oxymoron.
Yeah, exactly.
It's you know, it's deeply disappointing. I expected from Trudeau, but I've come to expect it from Doug Ford. You know, I thought he was the real deal 4 years ago. I thought he was his brother, but turns out he's not.
Yeah, never judge someone by their siblings, for better or for worse. Let that be a lesson that we learned in all of this.
Yeah.
So Yankee, what are you going to be doing for the Trucker Commission? Are you just here to hang out in the Airbnb?
He's here to hang out and sell
here
food.
to hang out. No, I had to come see it in person. I did miss the trucker convoy because I was back home working all day. So I happened to have been around the area. So I decided to pop in, see what it is in real life. And mostly my job is behind the scenes, making sure all the clips get up, making sure that everyone could find the clips and doing the social media in general. So I was in the area, as I said, so I popped in to bug William and wish him a happy birthday.
Yeah, exactly. I know Yankee was there last time, and last time he was at the Rebel News Airbnb, the Airbnb got raided. So I hope he won't stay here for too long.
He's a heat score.
In there.
Exactly. I don't want him to stand in front of the police like this because they're trying to raid our Airbnb once again.
Yeah. Yeah, let's not do that. Okay. But we have some updates coming on that. It's part of the lockdowns. The Trucker Commission is part of Trudeau shutting down the lockdowns. But regarding the Airbnb and the lawsuits that we have and the Montreal police, we'll have an update in the coming weeks.
Yeah, you guys have been working behind the scenes to bring everybody a more comprehensive story about what has happened then, but also since, and what we're doing about it. Because, I mean, could you imagine? That was our office. Could you imagine if CBC's office was raided? They'd be losing their minds. Just, I mean, but they'd have to be doing something raid-worthy, right? Like questioning the regime. They don't do that. But could you imagine if any news outlet was raided? Never.
Never. Well, they tried with a few different judges to get a warrant for, I believe it was around 10 hours. They couldn't get one, and then they just left.
They couldn't get one because it's BS.
Yeah, because it's BS. Well, causing a lot of harm in the way, obviously, for freedom and for people individually. But they just left. That's how that night ended. They just left. And I believe nobody has received any tickets outside of David from that night, from the day. Like they told the media they're going to be sending $6,000 fines to each rebel, which that day, I keep saying night because I was usually out at night. That day, they did not give any tickets so far. Maybe they'll send them in the mail. Who knows? Because I did receive tickets in the mail almost a year later. Ridiculous, but I did.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Do you have any chats from today's live stream to
we
go back to what happened in Ottawa?
Yeah, we've got 3 from Atomot. I think this is Adam Ottawa, a regular viewer on
Adam
on Adam Ottawa. Anyways, $5. Violence that they felt that was worth $5 to write. Yeah, that's a quote from Chief Bell. Feelings violence, so like physical felt, but like their feelings were hurt.
Bad vibes. Wrong
bad
vibes, I guess.
Yeah. Did he get his badge from a Cracker Jack's box? Apparently he's a 27-year police officer, so he knows better. But I guess the moral of the story is wokeism can get you at any point in your career. And while we saw some good cops from the OPP, particularly Abrams and Morris. You've got a Bill Blair on your hands here with Steve Bell, where he's more concerned about the politics and being upwardly mobile and perhaps running for the Liberals than actually being a good cop for his community.
Yeah. Well, the first part of this chat from Adam. By the way, this Adam Ottawa. Thank you for sharing this city with me here in Ottawa. this corrupt city filled with liberals everywhere. Congratulations. But yeah, you see the left. The left claims that speech is violence. So according to them, if your feelings are hurt, if what another person tells you, if you don't agree with that message, it is violence. That's the leftist mantra. So it's not surprising to see these left-leaning individuals testifying and saying that speech is violence.
Okay, the problem with that is we just can't laugh at them. The problem with that, though, is we just can't laugh at them because when they are labeling your speech as violence, what do you do or what are you justified in doing when someone's committing violence against you? And that's
defend yourself.
Self-defense, and you can meet violence with violence, and that's how somebody gets punched out for having the wrong opinion.
Yeah, well, they say punch a Nazi, and then they decide everyone is a Nazi, including myself. I've been called a Nazi. I'm very Jewish and a grandson of Holocaust survivors, and it's like I'm the Nazi. Well, they are, and then they say punch a Nazi, and then they punch you. And well, they didn't punch me particularly, but they punched you at a women's march because you were not a woman complying with their fake crazy ideology.
Yeah, Yankee is the infamous Jewish Nazi that everyone's talking about. All right, do we have another chat?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, it's funny though because most people saying punch Nazis are they've never seen a real Nazi and they've never punched anybody in their whole life. Okay, we've got Adam
this one's interesting. Yeah,
I've got stuff to say about this too. Check out the sticker on Paul Champ.
I pointed it out when I saw it.
Paul Champ is the lawyer for the Ottawa busybodies. It says tax the rich. Champ doesn't believe in people working hard for the money. Champ is rich and he's a lawyer for rich people who's happy to make sure that the government cracks down on the rights of the working class. And this obnoxious weirdo hypocrite's got a tax the rich sticker on his expensive laptop. Do you think Paul Champ is sending any extra money to the federal government because he is a high income earner as a lawyer for busybodies? Of course not. That's just it's virtue signaling. Tax the rich. Oh, but not me. Not rich like me, rich like the trucker who makes $100,000 a year, but also has to make owner-operator payments on his truck and pay exorbitant fuel taxes.
Champ is probably the most unprofessional lawyer I've seen the commission yet.
Oh, he gets handsy.
When you get handsy, when you hit a reporter because he asks questions that you don't like seeing being asked, then you're having this thousands of dollars worth laptop. With a
Let's keep our powder dry.
Yeah, with a tax the rich sticker on it, and you wear a great suit with a large tie. You are part of that. You are part of that population that is rich.
Yeah, well, again, asking questions are violence. That's why he was allowed to shove you. I don't think it was a punch, but it was more of a something like that.
Like physical.
That wasn't a punch.
Shoved you out of the way.
Yeah, it wasn't a punch.
The exact video, but I've seen it. He definitely touched you because your words were violence, and that's what he did, or maybe he denies it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. Just they say you're being aggressive, but then they put their hands on you. I'm like, well, I think you have a different definition of aggressive than I do.
Yeah, I mean, you don't see Keith Wilson walking around with a "I love the Freedom Convoy" sticker on his laptop. You don't see him walking around even with a political message as a pin.
Yeah, but if he did, at least you would know that he lives it. Like like if Keith said, "I love freedom," like he literally that's his mantra.
Yeah, at least he stays professional.
You're the rich guy.
At least he stays professional. You're the rich guy not
sending any extra money. Yeah.
I've watched his line of questioning, and a lot of the times I'm like, what is he talking about? Like, what is his goal with these lines of questioning other than just talking. Like it's ridiculous. I don't know what he's trying to get at even sometimes, but that's how he questions. I guess he wants to prove that there was literal violence, which nobody knows of. Everyone is talking about third-party violence. They might have heard from someone else. Well, that was what's their name? Catherine McKinney. We're gonna go with they them. But also no firsthand.
Sorry.
No, me neither.
Well, we'll see who wins.
I promise not to misgender her. I promise not to misgender.
Do not misgender her. But we'll see who wins tonight. Well, we'll see who wins tonight, the mayoral race, and that will be very interesting to see how Ottawa residents feel or not, and what is in for Ottawa if there's another protest that the government doesn't approve of. Because as we spoke about, you guys spoke about earlier, the Ottawa, Steve Bell, the former interim police chief, said that the Emergencies Act was a good tool for them to, not necessarily that it was needed, but it was cool. It worked, removing all your rights apparently worked to, dictators love removing all the rights. It works.
You gotta, what do they say? You gotta break a few eggs to make an omelet. Like that's what a lot of the testimony that I heard, where they're like, well, it was helpful, things would have resolved on their own, but it was good. Like, of course it was good.
Yeah, it was good.
Like, because it made your life easier, and all I can tell is you're lazy. They're testifying that some of them were taking like 2 days off in the middle of this national emergency. I wish. Anyway, let's get to this
of course, it's laziness. Yeah, it's already been 15 minutes past 7. Do you have one last chat?
And I have like this much voice left in me. Okay, so
I actually spoke with Paul Otto Newman, I believe, today on Twitter. They were asking about the making sure that we announce when the live streams are. So they're every day at 6 p.m. Eastern time.
That's right. 6 p.m. Eastern time. So he says, he gives us $5. Thanks very much. We should all be grateful to the truckers in Ottawa and Coots. If it hadn't been for them, we would still likely have Aaron O'Toole as leader of the Conservative Party, and Danielle Smith wouldn't be Premier of Alberta. Paul, you're so wise. That is 100% true. If not for, Jason Kenney's treatment of lockdown resistors, and if not for the truckers at Coots, he would still be in power. And let me tell you, I ran into those truckers from Coots at the United Conservative Party AGM, and they were there as delegates, as members. And I said, were you guys members?
Interesting.
When Jason Kenney was trying to arrest you, when he was cracking down on you and telling lies about you, and they said, yeah, we were UCP members then. We were his people that he turned on.
Wow.
So then the party turned on him. Careful what you wish for.
There's a clear reason why Jason Kenney isn't the Premier of Alberta anymore, and isn't the leader of the UPC anymore as well.
Yes. That's UCP. I think that's the end of the show.
Yep.
Guys, thanks for letting my horrible voice be in your ears for the last hour and 18 minutes. Thanks so much for your hard work today, William. Yankee, look forward to seeing you do some work in Ottawa.
Try.
Valuable addition to the Airbnb while you're there. Thanks to everybody he does. Yankee never takes a minute off.
He makes everything louder in the Airbnb.
I make everything louder. That is true. Well, I hope your voice gets better. My mom actually texted me and said I should wish you better health, and especially your voice. So I know she's watching. I know she's watching. So.
Viewers are currently emailing me about my voice.
Sheila's dying. Oh, well.
Anyway, thanks so much, guys. Thanks to the team behind the scenes. I know you're all working very hard, too. Thanks to everybody who pitched in to keep the lights on. We'll see everybody back here tomorrow, same time, 6 Eastern, 4 Mountain. Pray to God that it isn't me. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.
In your evidence in chief, you kept using the word violence regarding protesters, right?
Yes.
All right. And You've heard the evidence of Superintendent Morris already. You sort of touched on that, and he had stated that the lack of violence in Ottawa during the protest was actually shocking.
So I don't recall that statement.
All right. So is it fair to say that when you use the phrase violence, you're not actually describing any form of physical assaults, are you? Well, physical assaults do contribute to what I'm describing. I was specifically describing the violence that our community felt as a result of the culmination of actions that the occupiers engaged in. So the violence that they felt, not actual violence, is that what you're saying?
That is correct. Not the criminal code definition of violence, but the violence that they felt by having incessant horns blared.
Right.
And by having trucks run 24/7 a day.
Right.
By having people intimidate them and follow them, and by having people rip masks off their head, by feeling sheltered in their homes.
Well, thank you. I understand what you mean. But you're not talking about violence under Section 2 of the CSIS Act, are you?
No, I'm not.
Thanks.